So we are back in GIMP, and I want to show you some ways to create some variety. So let's say that I've got this sort of green background I'm working with. One of the simplest things I can do is I can create a second color that's also green. Now they're both the same. And if I play with this a little bit, I can maybe darken it up by changing the value line. I could change the saturation and gray it up. A couple different ways I can go. Let me just make it a little darker. I can then play with the gradient, and foreground to background is the normal gradient. You could do square. That doesn't look great. The length of the line is going to change how far out each color goes. So if, for example, you wanted to have something that fades at the edges, that actually looks pretty good now. So that could be a decent background. Notice it's got a little more depth to it, a little more interest than just going with a single solid color. So let me undo those. Some other options. I could just do a foreground to background. Oh, that's got a funny hard edge to it. I don't like that. Let's try that again. Foreground to background, standard old way. There we go. And you can do an angle if you prefer. If you wanted to call attention in. All these things are going to help create some sense of texture to the page. It doesn't just feel like one thing. Again, you can really get a feel for, you can make that linear instead. There we go. It's got all these different options. There's a spiral. That looks pretty stupid. I would say in general, you're better off either with a square or a line, or you might occasionally have occasion for this, which would go in both directions, like sort of like that. Okay, so that's one set. The other thing that GIMP has is it's got a fair number of things it can render. So this clouds can be interesting, an interesting option. It can render fog. I would actually probably not recommend making it orange. You could, if you remember your color here, you could copy that color, and I'm not sure why that wasn't one of the options by default, but I'll go back here to reshow fog. I'm gonna paste in my color name from before. Give me my little greenish thing. And it's gonna render some clouds. Now it's hard to see against my background, but if I did that, now you can see it. And let's say I created a white background. I gotta move the layer down. Now you see how that cloud rendering looks. It's got just a little bit of interest to it. That can be great if you've got another picture in there. You could add the cloud over another layer, so I could show both of these layers. Let's get rid of that guy. And then maybe I'd add some picture in between. Like let's say I grabbed my dumplings here. I'll copy that. Oops, paste that in, new layer. Move that down. I could add the clouds over it. Okay, that looks kind of stupid, but you get the idea. If it were something more interesting than dumplings, that might actually work. I can have lots of dumplings. Look at all my dumplings. Put those under the clouds, and we add a little bit of visual interest to it. So there's a second option. There's the clouds filter. Again, that was filters, render, clouds, and they've got a few different options you can play with. They have fractals you can play with. Most of those are just gonna feel kind of silly. There's a little Spirogyra thing. That's kind of fun. I'll show you what this does. This is probably not going to be super useful unless you're doing something ridiculous. But come on, isn't that fun? That could have been a nice bullet. Few other things you can play with. Once you have it, you can always do more of this blurring. Oh, one other thing that can be useful for a solid color background, let me get rid of all these other layers. And let's just make a brand new layer, just the foreground color, my solid color. You can play with these lighting effects. So if you go into light and shadow, a few options I could do. Lens flare, can barely see that on such a light color. But for example, on a banner, that might be quite useful. If I, here, let me imagine, for example, let's say this banner was going to be a deeper color. I'll go with a red. And then let's add some lens flare. And get a sense of how this would look. Ooh, it's 1994, so that's an option. The other thing you might actually use would be just a subtle lighting effect. Whoopsie daisies. Let's try that again. Reshow. Whoa. So this will let you add a light somewhere. You can move the light further away. You can increase its intensity, so I'd probably make it further out but more intense. There we go. Now we're getting somewhere. And there we have a nice subtle lighting effect, so it feels like the thing is lit up. You also could add a drop shadow, lights and shadow, drop shadow. That's going to make it appear to stick out from the ground. I'll show you how this works. That's going to now create a shadowed effect like this thing is off the page. So let me go ahead and export this guy so you can see how that drop shadow actually looks on the web page. Oops, I think I lost my web page. File. Unfortunately, I made the drop shadow too. I changed the size of that, so that didn't work. I messed up there. That's okay, one could imagine. You'd have to fix the size of this thing. And your shadow would be right. I'm going to merge. Oops. All right, a couple of neat effects. I think we're all done there.